In Genesis chapter 37 and verse number 2, we read about a man named Joseph. Joseph was the son of Jacob, whose other name was Israel. Jacob, just for the sake of context, was the son of Isaac and the grandson of Abraham. Out of all of Jacob's sons, he loved Joseph the most. Perhaps you remember that Jacob had 12 sons, and Joseph was by far the favorite. As a demonstration of that favoritism, he made for Joseph a robe of many colors. There are some versions of the Old Testament that say that Jacob made for Joseph a tunic with long sleeves. I think that just about ruins any Sunday school class or any VBS that I've ever been a part of. But here he makes for him a robe of many colors. And maybe some of you can relate to this. How would you feel if you had a brother, a sister, a sibling who was loved so much more than you, who was favored over you in every way? We see how his brothers responded. When they saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated Joseph and could not speak peacefully to Joseph. Joseph has a couple of dreams we read about in Genesis chapter 37 that all point to his brothers, his father, his family bowing down before him. When he told those dreams to his brothers, the text says that they hated him even more. They were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. There's a particular day when all of Jacob's other sons were out pasturing his flock near the place called Shechem. And Jacob told Joseph, who was at home, I want you to go and check on your brothers. Go and see how they're doing. Go and make sure that everything is okay. And so when his brothers see him coming, when they see him off on the horizon, you see how much they hated him. You see how much disdain they had for him. They conspired against him to kill him. Nobody else is around, and so here's our opportunity. Joseph is coming out to us. Let's kill him. One of the brothers, named Reuben, didn't want Joseph to be killed. He was going to return and restore Joseph back to their father, Jacob. He convinced his brothers not to shed his blood, not to kill him, but instead throw him into this pit that's present here with us in the wilderness. So that's exactly what they did. In verses 23 and 24 of Genesis chapter 37, they take off his robe of many colors and they threw him down into the pit. Now, I know some of you can relate to this. It's really hard to have a meal when you have a toddler screaming at the table, isn't it? Can you imagine how Joseph would have been screaming as he's down in the pit, begging and pleading for his brothers to save him, to rescue him? Hey, let's talk about this. Maybe we can work something out. You see how hard their hearts are towards their brother as he's screaming and pleading for their help. They sat down to eat a meal. And as they're eating this meal, they once again look off into the horizon. They see a caravan of traders coming through the land, and the light bulb goes off. If we kill our brother Joseph, we're not going to get anything out of him. We don't gain anything from just killing him. So let's sell him to this caravan of traders on their way to Egypt. And that's exactly what they did. They sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Now let me remind you that Jacob's family was very wealthy. Jacob's family was very rich. 20 shekels of silver would have been absolutely nothing to them, especially when you divide it among 11 brothers. But it's not about the money here. It's about getting rid of their brother who they hated so much. So they sell him to that caravan of traders. Joseph ends up going to the land of Egypt. When he gets to Egypt, he's purchased by a man named Potiphar as a slave. Potiphar was an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Everything in Joseph's life had been completely turned upside down. Can you imagine it? Going from living in your father's house, being the favorite child, but being hated by your brothers so much that they threw you down in a pit and then sold you to this caravan of traders. Everything in his life had been turned upside down except for one thing. The Lord was with Joseph. And because the Lord was with Joseph, he became a successful man. He was so successful in Potiphar's house, in verse number 4, that he was made overseer of the house. He was put in charge of all that Potiphar had. The only thing that Potiphar had to worry about was the food that he put in his own mouth. The Bible tells us that Joseph was handsome in form and he was handsome in appearance. Everything is going as well as it possibly can be as a slave in this Egyptian's household for Joseph until Potiphar's wife steps into the story. After a time, his mother's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and demanded, this is a command, this is an imperative, lie with me. But Joseph refused. He starts thinking about his master Potiphar and how much his master had entrusted to him. He's put me in charge of everything that he has. The only thing that he's withheld from me is you. How could I do this against him? But he asks the question in verse number 9 that I think is even greater and more pressing. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? But she didn't give up. Day after day, she would press him to lie beside her or to be with her, to the point that on one occasion, on one day, she even put her hands on Joseph, grabbed him by his garment, trying to force him to be sexually involved with her. But Joseph was so intent on getting away that he wrestles away from her, he leaves his garment in her hand and flees, got outside of the house as quickly as he could. Of course, Potiphar's wife didn't like that. She now has Joseph's shirt in her hand, so what does she do? She frames him. This Hebrew boy who you've brought into the house, she says a couple of times there in Genesis 39, he has tried to force me to be sexually involved with him. She frames it all, blames it all on Joseph, and of course Potiphar as a husband is angry about that. The text says that his anger was kindled and Joseph was put into a prison, not just any prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he remained there for some time. You're sold as a slave into Potiphar's house, and it seems like things are going well, at least as well as they possibly can be. Then you're falsely accused, you're thrown in prison, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Just like he was made overseer over Potiphar's house, he was made overseer of the prison. Joseph was put in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. After a short time, there were two individuals who were placed in this same prison. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt's chief cupbearer, and also his baker. One night, they have a couple of dreams, and they're really troubled by these dreams. They want to know the interpretation of these dreams. They want to know what these dreams mean. And I love Joseph's response in verse number 8, don't you? They said to him, "We've had dreams. There's no one to interpret them." Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." Joseph's been through so much adversity and trial and tribulation, but he still has his eyes on God. He still loves God. He's still living a life that is faithful to God, giving God all of the credit and the glory. Interpretations belong to God. Tell the dreams to me, and God will give an answer to you. So the chief cupbearer is the first to describe the circumstances of his dream. Joseph gives the interpretation that in 3 days, the chief cupbearer is going to be restored to his office. And he's going to place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as he did formerly. Joseph just makes one request. Just remember me. When you stand before Pharaoh again, remember me. Mention me to him. He says, because in verse 15, I was stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here I've done nothing that they should put me into the pit. I'm completely innocent. I don't deserve to be here. Please mention me to the king. Did Joseph's interpretation come true? Verse 21, he restored the chief cupbearer to his position. He placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Was Joseph remembered by the cupbearer? Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So Joseph stays in prison for another 2 years. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh himself has a couple of dreams. The text says that his spirit was troubled. He wanted to know what these dreams meant. So he sent for all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men, but there was none who could interpret the dreams to Pharaoh. The chief cupbearer finally remembered. Those circumstances jogged his memory. Hey, Pharaoh, I remember now when I was in prison, there was this young Hebrew man who was able to interpret my dream and the dream of the baker. Maybe He can do that for you. Maybe He can interpret your dream too. So he's prepared and brought before the king, Pharaoh. And Pharaoh told him, I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I've heard that you have this magical capability that anytime you hear a dream, you can give the meaning. And once again, we love Joseph's answer. He said, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Don't you think there's a lot that we can learn from that response? It's not about me. It's not in me. It's not some magical capability that I have. God is the one who's going to give you a favorable answer. So Pharaoh describes the dreams. Joseph tells him that God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There's going to be 7 years of great plenty throughout the land of Egypt, where there's going to be all kinds of food and the harvests are going to yield in abundance. But following that 7 years of plenty, there's going to be 7 years of famine that will consume the land, and the famine will be very severe, Joseph warned him. So he doesn't just tell him what God is about to do, he tells Pharaoh what he should do. Take 1/5 of the produce, take 1/5 of the grain during the 7 years of plenty, store it up in all of your different cities so that you will have food when the 7 years of famine comes. If you do that, the land will not perish through this famine. Pharaoh was so impressed with Joseph's ability through God to interpret the dreams, the advice that Joseph had given, that he makes Joseph second in command in all of Egypt. Can things change on a dime? Here he's hated by his brothers, he's sold into slavery, he's put into prison and held there for a few years, being completely innocent. And now Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is speaking to him, only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. When we first met Joseph, he was 17 years old. Now at the end of Genesis 41, he's 30 years old when he entered into the service of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. We've covered about 13 years of Joseph's life in our study so far. And just like Joseph said, those 7 years of plenty came and went. Then came the 7 years of famine. Who do you think came to Egypt during the 7 years of famine to get grain? Chapter 42 and verse 3, 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt, and they meet face to face for the first time since they sold him. In Genesis 42 and verse 6, Joseph was governor over the land, and his brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. Remember those dreams Joseph had back in chapter 37, that his family, his brothers are going to bow down before him? You have those dreams being fulfilled right here, Genesis 42 and verse number 6. But the thing about it, Joseph recognized his brothers, but his brothers did not recognize him. Of course, they thought that Joseph was long gone. Maybe they thought that Joseph was dead at this point, that he hadn't survived. They didn't expect Joseph to be the governor who they're bowing down before. He would have looked different. He would have talked different. He recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. And so the text says that he treated them like strangers, and he spoke roughly to them. That happens throughout a few cycles. Chapter 42, chapter 43, chapter 44, until we come to this scene in chapter 45 and verse 1, where Joseph could no longer control himself emotionally. He clears the room, he makes everyone go out of the room, and it was in that moment that he made himself known to his brothers. And I want you to hear what he says to his brothers. In chapter 45 and verse 5, he says, "Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here." Don't look back and feel bad about what you did. Don't look back and be distressed or feel sorrow or be angry with the decision that you made. Why? For God sent me before you to preserve life. Joseph is not just thinking about what happened in his life. He's not just thinking about what his brothers did to him. He's thinking about how God is at work in his life, how God is working all of these details together. God sent me before you to preserve life. Look at verse 7. God sent me before you. Maybe Joseph couldn't see it in the moment when he was being sold, when he was in Potiphar's house, when he was in prison for more than 2 years, but he sees it so clearly now when he looks back. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. Look at verse 8. It was not you who sent me here, but God. You're not the reason that I came to Egypt. You're players in the game. You're characters in the story, but you're not the reason that I'm here. God is the reason that I'm here. He's made me a father to Pharaoh and Lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. You fast forward to Genesis chapter 50, the last chapter in the book of Genesis. Joseph's entire family moves to Egypt, and they live with him. They're able to be together once again. When the father, Jacob, Israel, dies, the brothers start to get worried. Maybe now that our father is removed, Joseph's going to take vengeance on us. Maybe Jacob was the only thing holding him back from hurting us, from repaying us for what we've done. But then you see Joseph's heart in Genesis 50 and verse 20. He says, "As for you, you meant evil against me." He doesn't deny it. He says to his brothers, "You wanted to hurt me. You wanted to do harm to me. You meant evil against me, but not God. God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." So you look at the story of Joseph. You think about everything that he went through and all the details we've looked at, the details that we had to skip over for the sake of time. Joseph went through a lot, didn't he? Joseph was favored by his father, but he was hated by his brothers. He was sold as a slave, a servant in the land of Egypt, a land foreign to him. He was falsely accused of sexual misconduct. He was kept in prison for years, even though he hadn't done anything to deserve it, even though he was completely innocent. He served as an overseer in Potiphar's house and in prison. He interpreted dreams for the chief cupbearer and the baker, for even Pharaoh, the king of Egypt himself. Think about the roller coaster that Joseph was constantly on. You think about all the feelings. You think about all the emotions that Joseph would have had. You think about the highs. You think about the lows, the mountain peaks and the valleys. Joseph had been through so much. He had endured so much trial and hardship and difficulty. But when he gets to the end of his life and he's able to look back, what does he see? God was working in order to bring about good. God took everything that happened to Joseph. He took every detail of Joseph's life. He took the good, the bad, and the ugly in order to bring about something good, in order to bring about a positive outcome. Joseph serves as an overseer in Potiphar's house. He serves as an overseer in prison. What does it prepare him for? It prepares him to be an overseer over the entire country of Egypt in order to provide grain, in order that survivors might come out of this 7 years of famine. You walk through the details, you see everything that happened in his life. You think about all the hardship and the difficulty and the grief that he went through. He comes to the end of his life and says, "I see how God was working. God never left me. God was with me. God was working in me. God was working through me. God took everything in my life and He worked it together for good so that many people might be kept alive." This might be the question on your mind. Why? Tyler, why would we spend a good amount of our time this morning walking through the story of Joseph, thinking about everything that he went through, considering how God was working in his life? Here's my answer. Our circumstances and our context are a lot different than Joseph's, I understand that. But I believe that God works in our lives in the exact same way. We're thinking about the promises of God in this series of lessons. Consider for just a moment the promise that's made, the promise we read just a few moments ago in Romans chapter 8 and verse 28. How does Paul begin? He says, "And we know." In other words, you don't have to doubt this. There are no question marks around this. This is something we can be absolutely confident about. This is a firm foundation that we can stand on. Do you want a message that you can place your faith in? Do you want a message that you can trust wholeheartedly, that will always be true? Here it is in Romans 8 and verse 28. And we know. What is it that we know? All things work together for good. Just like with Joseph, you and I go through a lot in our lives, don't we? You and I experience a lot as we go from day to day, week to week, month to month. You know as well as I do that as we go throughout life, there are times of happiness, but there are also times of sadness. We go through grief and trials, tribulations, and hardships. We experience love, especially in the relationships that we consider to be the closest to us. We all sin and fall short of the glory of God. We do things we shouldn't do. We say things we shouldn't say. We think things that we shouldn't think, but we also experience success. Can you look back in your past and see victories that God granted to you? We look back in our lives and we see moments of disappointment. There are times when we experience loss. Some of you right now are experiencing some very serious health problems, physical health problems. And if you're not there, then chances are one day we're going to be there. One day that's going to come. But maybe it's not physical problems we're dealing with. Maybe it's mental or emotional or psychological. We deal with anxiety, stress, and worry. There are times when we experience growth. We go through seasons of change and transition. Sometimes we have to step into the unknown. I don't know what's on the other side of the door, but I have no other choice but to open up that door and to walk through it. There are times when we're learning. There are times when we have to make sacrifices in certain circumstances or certain relationships. The list could go on, but what's the promise of Romans 8 and verse 28? The promise is not that everything that happens to you in your life will be good. We know that not to be true. The promise of Romans 8 and verse 28 is that God takes every detail of your life and He works it together for good. God in our lives takes the good, the bad, and the ugly and causes it to result in a positive outcome. That might be hard to see in the moment. That may be hard to see in the present, but when we look back, what can we see? We can see God working behind the scenes in order to produce good in our lives. Now, we need to spend just a couple minutes talking about and thinking about that word, good. God works all things together for good. Sometimes my definition of good is not God's definition of good. And I think that's true for all of us. So when we read Romans 8 and verse 28 and we preach and we place our faith in this message that God works all things together for good, I don't want it to be based on my standard of goodness. I want it to be based on His standard of goodness. So what is God's definition for good? Keep reading and I think you find out. God's definition for good in Romans 8, 29 and 30 is that we are more conformed every day into the image of His Son, Jesus Christ. God's definition of good is that we are a part of this group that He foreknew and predestined and called into relationship with Himself. God's definition of good is that we are justified, where He's able to look at us just as if we've never sinned, where He makes us righteous and clothes us with the very righteousness of His Son, Jesus Christ. God's definition of good is that we will one day be glorified with Him throughout all of an eternity. What's God's definition for good? God's definition for good is different than mine, but it's so much greater than mine. His definition for good is that I become more like Jesus, that I look more like Him every day, and that I spend an eternity with Him when this life is over. And so when we say that God works all things together for good, we're not talking about physical prosperity. We're not saying that God takes every detail of your life and works it together so that you can have a better job opportunity, a higher paying job, more money, a bigger house, a nicer car. We're saying that God works together everything, all things, not some or most, but all things for good so that we can grow in our faith, so that we can draw closer to Him as we march towards our eternal home. Now, who is this promise for? This promise is not for everybody. This promise is for those who love God. This promise is for those who love the Lord their God with all their heart, soul, and mind, the first and great commandment. In Matthew 22, 37 and 38, this promise is for those who love Jesus so much that they're going to keep His commandments. Jesus, I love You with everything that I have. I just want to do whatever You want me to do. I'm laying my life down as a living sacrifice, holy, pleasing, acceptable to the Lord. Romans chapter 12 and verse number 1. This promise is for those who are called according to His purpose. We read in 2 Thessalonians 2 and 14 that God calls us how? He calls us through the gospel. When the gospel is preached, God is calling out to you. God is reaching out to you to step into relationship with Himself, to step out of your sin, to step out of the world. You and I as Christians have heard that gospel call. We've responded to it. We've accepted it in our own hearts and lives. And as a result, we become a part of those who are called according to His purpose, which you can read more about, as we said, in verses 29 and 30. But realize, this promise is not unconditional. This promise is not for everybody. This promise is not for all people. This promise is conditional upon us loving God, being a part of the called according to His purpose. This promise is conditional upon us living our lives for Him every day. Remember Joseph? Joseph was faithful to God. He loved God. He gave all the credit and glory to God as God was working in his life. That's the picture that we see in Romans 8 and verse 28, and it's the picture that we should see in our own lives. Now, the word that's oftentimes been used to describe this promise from God is the word providence. Have you heard that word before? Have you heard people talk about the providence of God? That word is made of two Latin terms. The first term means before. The second term means to see. When we talk about God's providence, we're saying that He sees beforehand. You ever feel as if you're overlooked? You ever feel as if you're forgotten about? You ever feel like nobody sees me? Nobody sees my life? Nobody sees how I'm feeling? God says, I do. God sees beforehand. God saw every detail of your life before you even existed. God knew and saw every decision that you would ever make before any of this was ever here. Before, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God saw you. But it's not just God seeing beforehand. You see a word in the term providence? Do you see another word? What about the word provide? God sees beforehand every detail of our life, every decision that we would make. And in His infinite power and wisdom and strength, He works all things together for good to provide for us. He sees beforehand so that He can provide for His people. What a wonderful promise. We know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose. There's a little boy who loved puzzles, and his father, as a gift, brought him back home a puzzle one afternoon. He immediately opened up the box, which was completely blank. All that it said on the box was map of the United States. He dumps out all the pieces on the floor, and this little boy, 5 or 6 years old, tries to put together all the pieces. But he's visibly getting frustrated, because he doesn't know where all the pieces go. He's never seen the United States before. He doesn't know what our country looks like. And so as he tries to put together the pieces, there's no picture. He has no idea where the pieces are supposed to go. And so the father steps in, sees that his son is frustrated. He stoops down and starts putting together the puzzle himself. Within just a few moments, the puzzle starts to take shape. You can begin to see the picture. And the son asked his father, how were you able to do this? Why couldn't I do this? How were you able to put together this puzzle? And the father said, son, I've seen the entire picture. I know what the United States looks like. And because I've seen the entire picture, I know where to put all of the pieces. You and I have a lot of pieces, don't we? And sometimes we get frustrated because we don't know where those pieces are supposed to go. We don't know how all of these pieces are supposed to fit together. Maybe sometimes we're looking at all of these pieces in our lives and we start to think, well, I think I'm missing a few. I think I'm missing a few pieces out of this box. You and I don't know how to put all the pieces together because we can't see the whole picture. But we have a Father who does see the whole picture. We have a Father who sees beforehand, knows all the details of our lives, knows every decision that is made before it is made. And because He sees the whole picture, He's able to put the pieces where they need to go. Do we trust Him? Because He sees the whole picture, He's able to take every detail of our lives, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and He's able to produce a portrait that looks more like His glorious Son, Jesus Christ. This is God's promise to us. We don't see it in the moment, but we can trust in what God's Word is telling us. We can trust in what He's done in the past for His people, like Joseph. Do you and I trust in the providence of God? Do we trust that God is with us, that He's working through us, that He's working in us in order to bring about good? But this promise isn't for everybody. Do you love God? I mean, do you really? Do you love Him with everything? Do you love Him so much that you're willing to do whatever He's commanded? Are you a part of the called, those who are called according to His purpose? If there are any doubts, if there are any question marks, let me take you back to just the first few words of Romans 8 and verse 28. And we know. Do you know this morning? If not, we'd love to help you as together we stand and sing.